head over to patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps and sign up for my free content page, where I'll be interacting with you, doing live streams, posting exclusive content, and dropping a major limited series podcast exclusively for Patreon members. That's patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. Everything in your life seems to be on a perfect course. Great job, long-term marriage, 2 beautiful daughters. Your career is soaring. So why would you, without any warning or indication, kill yourself with a poison not generally associated with suicide? My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of close to 50 books. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. A cliche you might hear from an old-school type of mother to her young daughters is, marry a doctor. Find a nice, tall, handsome surgeon and get him standing next to you at the altar. Gregory Brent Dennis wasn't a surgeon. Yet when Susan Winters met him, David was a doctor, a respected psychologist. He wasn't tall, dark, and handsome either. Of average height, with silver and black hair, bumpy facial skin, thick gray eyebrows, Greg struck the serious gaze of the professional he seemed to be. Greg's wife Susan is a lawyer with ambitions of soon going to work for her family's very large business, the Winters Restaurant Group, which owned over 100 franchises across the country. So the lawyer and the doctor rounded out what many considered to be the perfect, happy couple. But of course you know, especially if you watch Dateline, which this guy never does. Sorry, it's too sugary and over the top for me. That we are not here talking about this case if this marriage was something from a 1950s television sitcom. Susan and Greg live in a rather expensive home in Henderson, Nevada, a suburb of Las Vegas, about 15 miles southeast of the city, bathed in bright lights. If you are familiar with Henderson, you'll know it's infamous for its outdoor recreation with over a whopping 225 miles of trails and 70 parks. And yet Henderson is, like most of the landscape surrounding Las Vegas, mainly desert, which makes it like 2,000 freaking degrees in the shade in the winter. Seriously speaking, it can get as hot as 120 in summer and doesn't really dip below 75 in the heart of winter. The population has skyrocketed from 3,600 residents in 1950 to over 350,000 today, which makes sense, really, as we look back and see Las Vegas being born. For Greg and Susan, of course, that amount of people offered the ideal location to treat patients and represent clients. There was no shortage of work for either of them. Susan is a beautiful woman, dirty blonde hair, blue eyes, flawless skin, and an overall jovial demeanor around family and friends. She is also, I'll say, very adored and loved by her immediate family. She grew up in Oklahoma with one brother in a loving environment with parents who supported whatever decisions she made. By 1990, after receiving a political science degree from the University of Oklahoma, Susan decided to add a law degree. Once she passed the bar, Susan's career took off. She managed a private practice in Oklahoma City went to work for the Clark County District Attorney's Office and also served as a judge for a brief time. Both divorced, Susan and David met in 1995, hit it off, have 2 daughters together, and wind up building a seemingly picture-perfect life, ready to take on the world. By 2013, Greg and Susan ran into some difficulties, decided to separate, and began discussing divorce. The impetus for this, according to friends, was that Susan believed Greg was cheating on her. But not just with some floozy he met in a bar or picked up somewhere else, which we will soon get to. After both deciding to work on things by attending marriage counseling, they reconciled, worked their way through it, and were ready now to head into another chapter of life together. Seems to be the American way. We are all human beings, in the end, with issues and hang-ups. A few years later, in 2015, while Greg and Susan are living in Henderson, their daughter's mostly grown, Greg says later Susan begins struggling mentally, often finding herself wading through terrible bouts of depression. With Greg being a respected psychologist, one would think he had the upper hand here and was able to help his wife get over, or at least deal with, any pain she is experiencing. Susan's family and friends say that over the Christmas holiday 2014, Susan was in a great frame of mind. She is a devoted mom and very close to her daughters, one friend says. On the night of January 2nd, 2015, 48-year-old Susan heads off to bed around 9 p.m. Susan seems to be having a particularly tough time of late, and she expressed, Greg later says, or had given an indication that she has been thinking about killing herself. Things had gotten to a point where, according to Greg, Susan had lost all hope. Treatment wasn't working anymore, Greg insists. She doesn't know what to do. When January 3rd, early morning broke, Greg says he woke up to find Susan unresponsive. She wasn't waking. So he calls 911 and the paramedics arrive near 7 a.m. Susan isn't breathing. Minutes later, after running an EKG, paramedics call a flatline and declare Susan dead. She's been very depressed and threatened suicide. Greg, for some reason, tells EMTs on the scene. She might have ingested antidepressants and antifreeze, he adds. Seems pretty specific if you ask me. Yet Greg has good reason to suspect this, he claims. Miraculously, as Greg and an officer are talking, paramedics announce that they are able to get a pulse back on Susan, but need to get her to the hospital quickly. As officers search the house, specifically the bedroom where Susan was found unresponsive, they do not find any empty medication bottles or evidence she could have ingested antifreeze. There is no suicide note. Moreover, Susan had not been picking up her medications. Greg seems very distraught. He doesn't understand what happened, he says. He thought she was depressed, but didn't expect she would try to kill herself. Sure, we've been arguing lately, he tells law enforcement, and have argued in the past, but she has threatened to kill herself many times. The indication here, I guess, is she's been crying wolf, but she'll never do it. Apparently, she finally did. They ask him how things were in the house recently. Tense, he says. We've been having arguments on an increasing level. One time, she said she wanted to jump off a bridge. She's taking medications for depression and also Xanax. They ask if there is anything else he can add. Greg then says he noticed 2 bottles of antifreeze were out of place in the garage, which is why he suggested she might have used it to facilitate her death. I also caught her on the internet looking up how to kill yourself with antifreeze. As they chat more, Greg talks about that day before and what they did. He says they were drinking together and Susan was mixing drinks with her anxiety medications. She said something about our daughters not caring for her anymore, Greg adds. So she was upset and depressed. I think they get the picture by now. Law enforcement doesn't get the feeling that Greg is selling all of this, but more or less just telling them what has been going on. Greg then says he and their daughters went out shopping about 6 p.m. the night before. Susan stayed home. She was sound asleep and snoring, actually. When we got back about 10:30, she was still sleeping. That's when I opened the computer and found that she had visited a web page about poisoning yourself with antifreeze. I eventually went to sleep next to her, and she was still snoring when I climbed into bed. She had threatened suicide so much, he tells them, that he began not to take her seriously. Again, the boy crying wolf. He let his guard down. Now she's dead. As they assess the conversation with Greg later, law enforcement is on the fence here with this one. They understand that when a spouse dies under mysterious circumstances, they need to look at the other spouse. And when you invite antifreeze into the party, well, that kind of screams murder. Yet there is no real evidence that Greg had anything to do with Susan's death. And it just very well may be that she decided to take her own life. Susan had told a psychologist the previous year that she had sat in the garage with the car running once, but didn't follow through because it was taking too long and she became too cold. When paramedics arrive at the hospital with Susan, she's gone. They lost her in the ambulance for a second time and were unable to bring her back. Law enforcement needs to get a look at the post-mortem before they can make a call here. Susan's death has the look and feel of a suicide, especially with her history of depression and, according to Greg, her talk of suicide. That is, I should note, if everyone is telling the truth and the evidence they collect backs it up. I'll be right back after a short break. When Susan's autopsy comes back, it proves that Susan died as a result of ingesting antifreeze, sure, but more so of an oxycodone overdose, a prescription, I might add, of which law enforcement did not find inside the house and she did not have from the local pharmacy. Which is kind of weird. There was also a very low amount of morphine in her system, the coroner tells investigators. Morphine. After a careful review of all the records in the case and the toxicology report, the Clark County Coroner's Office rules the manner of Susan's death to be suicide. A major part of the coroner's decision, he says, became the statements given by Greg on the evening of Susan's death. The internet search, the antifreeze bottles in the garage, and, largely, that Susan had expressed a desire to kill herself. Susan's parents, friends, and other relatives, after hearing the determination by the coroner, are livid. They cannot believe with all of the suspicious activity surrounding Susan's death, that law enforcement drops the case. Just like that. But to their shock, disappointment, and pain, that is what happens. So Susan's family decides to hire an ex-FBI agent, now working for a private investigation firm, to look into it all to see what he can shake out. About 5 days after Susan's death, Greg Dennis laid out all of Susan's belongings and invited all of her friends to come over and take what they wanted. That's a strange thing to do. Am I right? 20 years of marriage, I would think grief alone would have saddled the man for at least a longer period than a work week. Yet that was only the beginning of the odd behavior on Greg's part. Generally, in murder cases, if you discover someone's secrets, you can work backwards from there and uncover motive and additional evidence. In spousal murder cases, motive always leads you to that big reveal connecting your case together. So you search for a potential motive, and you can be sure to find the answers to the most pressing questions. But again, law enforcement is out, not investigating the case after the coroner ruled Susan's death a suicide. By the summer of 2016, however, that all changes. The Henderson Police Department reopens Susan's death as a murder inquiry. After that private investigation firm Susan's parents hired submit a detailed report with its findings to the Henderson Police Department. And look, I have to applaud the Henderson PD for taking it all seriously and listening. We all know egos are involved in police work, but the truth is what everyone involved here seemed to be after. So they deserve our praise. In a detailed 27-page affidavit written by the Henderson Police Department, they report that after learning about the private investigation firm's investigation, they were convinced Susan's death was murder and that Greg Dennis, her husband, killed her. A huge part of the evidence turns out to be a civil action case brought on by Susan's parents, in which Greg had to sit for a deposition. And a lot of what he had said under oath entirely contradicted what the earlier evidence gathered showed. Susan's family was not messing around. They owned more than 100 restaurant franchises and had plenty of cash on hand to spend finding out the truth about their daughter's death. Good for them. I see this time and time again. The parents of a victim want justice. They don't take no for an answer. They keep pushing. Sometimes that's what it takes. And so with all of that, the Henderson Police Department put a heading on Greg Dennis. And boy, oh boy, is all of this guy's very dirty laundry aired. One of the leading factors here is, of course, what Greg did for a living for over 20 years, treating suicidal people with severe depression. How does his own wife commit suicide under his nose if he's been treating the same types of people for 2 decades? Big question. There was also a very large life insurance policy in place, and Susan owned stake in a number of Sonic drive-in restaurants within her family's business, a lot of which Greg would receive upon her death. So we're back to the Dateline episode. When they went back and looked at Greg's phone records, freaking phone records, here we go, a murder scenario began to reveal itself. It appeared that Greg had been texting a known cocaine dealer all that day and into the evening hours. The dealer lived at a nearby casino. Susan had been, in fact, trying to call Greg all evening. Getting this information gave them coordinates where Greg's phone had been pinging throughout that night. And the Gregster wasn't at home or out shopping, as he had told police. Greg had also been in touch with another man, a guy who worked at his office one day a week, throughout the day and night, and the following day. They figured out that Greg had not even slept next to Susan that night, that he had instead met his cocaine dealer and the other guy at various times, returned to the house where Susan was allegedly sound asleep, and then he went out again. What's more, after Susan died, Greg was seen by the private investigator going to that casino 15 different days over a 2-month period. The private investigator had even watched Greg snort cocaine in his vehicle after leaving the casino. When they confronted Greg with this information, he admitted to purchasing not only cocaine, but Oxy, Xanax, and Viagra from the same dude. The Viagra was an interesting drug of choice to purchase, seeing that Greg had admitted to police that he and his wife had not been intimate for quite some time, which was verified by several friends of Susan's whom she had confided in. So who is it that Greg is having sex with to the point where he needs Viagra? Being a licensed psychologist, if Greg was ever caught abusing drugs, he would most certainly lose his license. Susan knew this, he told police, and she had threatened to turn him in on numerous occasions. That is motive, my friends. In one text exchange they found on Susan's phone, in which she was going back and forth with a friend 2 days before her murder, Susan was very upset. She said Greg was either having an affair or he was gay because he did not want to have sex with her. She then added how, on New Year's Day that same year, Greg demanded a divorce. What is shocking to me as I read through some of the materials was how often that other guy Greg knew, who worked 1 day per week at the office, also a psychologist, would prescribe drugs to patients who would turn around and give the drugs back to Greg. Like an exchange system, Oxy, Xanax, and other narcotics. Greg Dennis, there is no doubt, was a drug addict, law enforcement believed. And then they latch on to Bank First, the bank account Susan used to maintain her profits from her Sonic investment, an account of which Greg was not in any way in control of, meaning he had no access to that account whatsoever. This was all Susan's. We hear it time and time again. Follow the money. In murder cases like this one, if you do that, there is a solid chance you will uncover a roadmap to murder. Let's also talk a bit about antifreeze. It is not a poisonous substance you'd want to use to commit suicide. It can take days to die from the toxic, flu-like effects brought on by antifreeze poisoning, depending on how much you ingest, of course. And Susan had low levels in her system. Additionally, when investigators spoke to Susan's family members, they all agreed she was happier in the days leading up to her death, looking forward to the new year and getting away from Greg. So you see, all of this does not add up to what Greg was telling police back when they found Susan's body. The big reveal came when investigators were told by Susan's family Greg had deposited a check for $180,000 into his account from another account that only Susan had access to and could sign off for. He had also, and you have to ask yourself every time you hear this, why in the hell do they do it? Called the insurance company days after her death to inquire about a $1 million policy and how to get his hands on that cash. The answer, of course, as to the why they do it is greed. Greed is blinding. It dulls the senses. Still, all of that being said, the couple's daughters sided with their dad. During the deposition part of the civil suit Susan's family filed against Greg, the girls testified that they fully support their father. They said their mom had waged war against depression many years ago and that they believe she committed suicide. There was still so much to be done before they could charge Greg Dennis with murder. And some even believed at this point it would never happen. Let's take our final break here and come right back. I just want to say before we head into the final part of this case, there is a ton more evidence against Greg I have not gone over. It would take another hour of the show to do that, and you'd get bored after the list of internet searches alone. Once these cops got the green light that this was now a murder investigation, they did a thorough and tedious job of putting together what is a rock-solid case for murder, which is very important to mention considering the final outcome of this case. Greg Dennis had told everyone the couple were happy before Susan's death. Sure, they had issues, but overall, they had a solid marriage. That's bullshit. Recordings Greg made himself and saved to his phone of arguments proved as much. Susan had said to Greg one time, quote, "I don't want to be in my 50s with somebody who hates me as much as you do." What police believed happened is that Greg had tried over the course of a day to poison Susan with antifreeze, but it just wasn't working. She was getting ill, but would not die. So he met with his cocaine dealer on that night, January 2nd, 2015, and along with some cocaine, Greg also bought Oxy, enough to kill Susan. They cannot be sure how he got the drug into her system, but toxicology proved she died from an overdose of basically Oxy and morphine. While she was dying, law enforcement contends Greg checked the balances in her bank accounts and began to make his move to get those funds. He knew that once the family found out she was dead, they'd freeze her accounts. Of course, all of this is backed up by financial documents and computer forensics and, of course, phone data. The guy straight up lied about the entire night, and the evidence proves as much. It's surprising to me how people get caught lying by the phone data, computer forensics, and other unimpeachable evidence, and yet those who support them will not believe it or choose to look the other way when that evidence presents itself. Our courtrooms and investigations as a whole are changing remarkably as we speak, and not for the greater good. You all know what I am talking about. We see it now, case after case. The most damning, flawless evidence is questioned by idiots online and spreads and becomes part of a dialogue that should never become a part of a murder trial. That online community is working its way into jury rooms. Question everything. Take nothing at face value. That kind of thinking is having an effect on trials. Look, I am the first to say that we should question police work and make sure all the boxes are checked in investigations. But some evidence just stands there on its own for the sake of truth. And when we stop accepting that as truth, we've got a real problem. The best marketing and social media campaign should not affect juries. Quite the opposite. By February 2017, authorities feel they have enough and arrest Greg for Susan's murder. The pandemic delayed things for quite some time. Greg's lawyer and the prosecution during that time went back and forth and came to an agreement. Greg would walk into court and offer up an Alfred plea. The coward's way out. That's what that is. I'll go to jail, but I'm not going to say I'm a murderer. Voluntary manslaughter, in other words, which to me in this case, had there not been a COVID pandemic, would have never been considered. But here we are.
Mr. Dennis has elected not to speak today. However, he did submit a written statement to the probation office that states as follows. My wife passed away in early 2015, and this has been a very difficult time for my immediate family, which consists of my 2 young daughters. Through this time, we have remained a close family and supportive of each other. My 2 daughters still reside with me, and my goal was to protect them from the ongoing emotions attached to the judicial process. This resolution provides closure, as one of my goals was to prevent my daughters and others affected from having to undergo the stresses of a trial. Although during the last several years I have been at odds with Susan's loved ones, I want to express that I understand their sorrow. And both daughters are here today, Your Honor. They have asked me to read a statement that they have written, which I will also file with the court. To the Honorable Judge Levitt, we understand that our father has pled guilty pursuant to the Alford decision without making any admissions of guilt, and to avoid the risk of a harsher consequence at a trial. We decided as a family to take this path for the sole reason that it is time for us, as a family, to put this behind us, and not because we believe for a second that he had any involvement in our mother's death. On January 3rd, 2015, our mother tragically passed away as the result of lifelong mental health issues. Since that day, our family has been targeted and persecuted by the Winters family. For the past 7 years, we have been portrayed as brainwashed little girls who will do anything to defend their father. We knew the many wonderful qualities she possessed, as well as her flaws. Now we are 20 and 22 years old, and we more fully understand the issues our mother faced. Unfortunately, many women, including us, have similar issues that are difficult to accept. The signs of suicide are not always black and white, and our mother is a great example of someone who seemingly had a perfect life with little to no reason to commit suicide. Losing our mother was the hardest day of our lives, but the accusations against our father have brought trauma that cannot be overstated. The time, money, and resources that our grandparents, Dan and Avis Winters, have used to pursue our father could and should have been used to spread awareness to mental health struggles and suicide prevention.
So Greg is sentenced to 3 to 10 years. My guess is he'll serve the lower portion of those numbers, which is totally preposterous to me, considering the amount of evidence against the guy and the damage he did to Susan's family. A guy who was engaged in a gay lifestyle behind his wife's back, a drug addict, drowning in debt, with the possibility of losing his job and practice, and pointing a finger at that wife as being the cause. That's Greg. In 2023, Greg was found liable in civil court in order to pay Susan Winters' family $1 million. Cue the applause. Susan's father wrapped up what the rest of the family, save for Susan and Greg's daughters, who support the dad and believe she committed suicide, felt after it all. And he told NBC News this, quote, "For me to think about my daughter laying there, going through that with the antifreeze, oxycodone, whatever else he put in her body, there ought to be a special place in hell for him, and I hope he goes there." I can't add to that or argue with that. I'll be right back here next week with another new case. Be safe, be aware. Sources for this episode include 27-page Henderson Police Department Declaration of Arrest. Nevada Mom's Death First Thought to be Suicide by Jill Cedarstrom, February 26, 2025, NBC News. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinas. Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Music by Epidemic Sound. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.